Welcome to the debate. The federal indictment of former FBI Director James Comey, filed back in September 2025, has really sent shockwaves through the political and legal landscape. I mean, this isn't just another indictment, right? It is a profound challenge to the very notion of an independent Justice Department. So the fundamental question we have to confront today is this. Does this criminal prosecution of James Comey represent, a justifiable, maybe complex, but justifiable effort to enforce genuine accountability for breaches of conduct? Or does the evidence surrounding the whole process overwhelmingly point to a politically motivated hit job targeting a perceived adversary?
Well, that framing, while certainly urgent, it risks minimizing the actual substance of the charges, I think. I commit this from a slightly different perspective. While the political environment is, yes, undeniably toxic, we simply cannot ignore the long and frankly well-documented history of Comey's policy violations and institutional defiance. This indictment, which seems supported by a pattern of behavior thoroughly investigated by the Department of Justice Inspector General, represents a necessary and maybe even overdue attempt to hold even the most powerful officials accountable when they choose to disregard established legal frameworks.
See, I disagree fundamentally on the priority there. We absolutely must focus on the context of the indictment itself. The timing of this prosecution cannot, under any rigorous analysis, be separated from the intensely political environment and the explicit demands from the executive branch. I mean, the president has publicly and repeatedly called for the prosecution of perceived foes, referring to Comey as a dirty cop and corrupt James Comey. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, has already publicly described this indictment as a, quote, grotesque abuse of presidential power, arguing the administration has corrupted the legal system just to fulfill a campaign of retribution. And look at the process itself. The indictment follows the president's impatient and frankly extraordinarily direct social media posts urging the Department of Justice to, move forward immediately. And crucially, the Attorney General prosecuting this case, Pam Bondi, is one of the president's former personal attorneys. I mean, when the prosecutor is installed specifically after the previous top official was forced out and the charges follow a direct presidential command, well, the true motivation really appears to be political vengeance, not the pursuit of justice.
Okay. The skepticism regarding the political optics is understandable, I grant you that. But we have to maintain focus on the principle that no one is above the law. And this principle, it has to apply equally, right, to political friends and foes. When we look back, the issue isn't just about the current political climate, it's about Comey's history of prioritizing his personal judgment over the DOJ's institutional integrity. The evidence for this is substantial. The DOJ Inspector General, the OIG for short, thoroughly documented Comey's history of ad hoc decision-making based on his personal views. And this repeatedly rejected long-standing department policy. Just consider the public statements he made regarding the Clinton email investigation. The July 5, 2016 announcement that criticized her conduct while simultaneously recommending no charges, and then the October 28, 2016 letter to Congress right before the election. Both actions were flagrant violations of department protocol regarding commenting on pending investigations and announcing charging recommendations. And furthermore, the OIG also found that Comey violated FBI policy by retaining and leaking his unclassified memos of conversations with the president, an action Comey himself admitted was intended to prompt the appointment of a special counsel. So the current charges centered on false statements about authorizing leaks and testimony about classified information. They suggest accountability is finally catching up to a pattern of institutional disregard that began years ago.
Okay, but I challenge the idea that these past policy errors, however serious, provide a legitimate foundation for this current criminal prosecution. Let's dig into that OIG finding on ad hoc decision-making. The reports clearly show Comey felt compelled to act outside of norms because he believed, rightly or wrongly, in an overriding public interest for transparency. He was facing an unprecedented political situation and worried, as he put it, about the world catching on fire if the DOJ handled the Clinton matter entirely in private. Now, while his execution was flawed, perhaps deeply flawed by poor coordination, those past missteps were policy and ethical errors driven by a subjective, albeit maybe misguided, belief in the necessity of maintaining public trust. This current indictment in 2025 is fundamentally different. It is clearly, I would argue, tainted by explicit presidential command, and it's focused on these very contested allegations of lying in 2020 testimony about authorizing leaks regarding classified information. The fact that this specific process was rushed and politicized, using a replacement prosecutor who was a former personal attorney to the president, well, that suggests the true motivation is not the rigorous application of the rule of law to correct past policy missteps. It feels like political vengeance disguised as jurisprudence. The timing and the actors involved, for me, invalidate any claim of neutrality here.
Right. And I think the core of our disagreement really lies in whether that explicit presidential rhetoric can somehow be used as a shield against a legitimate investigation into potential criminal conduct. When the OIG reviewed Comey's 2016 actions, they highlighted serious breaches long before the current administration even took office. I mean, Comey himself admitted he made a conscious decision not to tell department leadership about his plan to make the July 5th statement. He testified that he intentionally restricted the time available for department leaders to respond precisely because he believed they would instruct him not to speak publicly. He even viewed the resulting lack of direct engagement from DOJ leadership as them, quote, taking kind of a cowardly way out. Now, that wasn't really a transparency decision. That sounds more like institutional insubordination. So doesn't this indictment merely represent the eventual consequence, perhaps, of an FBI director who repeatedly believed his personal ethical compass superseded the department's own rules? The current charges concerning lying about classified information and leaks seem directly related to the chaos created by that initial pattern of self-exemption. If you constantly ignore institutional rules, you inevitably open yourself up to severe legal scrutiny down the line. Wouldn't you say?
Well, I must fundamentally disagree on the conclusion that this pattern justifies this current prosecution under these circumstances. Let's broaden the lens for a moment to the entire internal culture the OIG exposed. That OIG report was damning, finding that many FBI personnel demonstrated, quote, extremely poor judgment and a gross lack of professionalism. They cited those politically charged texts between high-level agents like Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, and acknowledged that FBI media policy was, quote, widely ignored throughout the entire organization. So if the goal is genuinely to clean up the institution, to drain the deep state or the swamp, as the president's supporters like to claim, why is the sole major criminal focus on James Comey? Doesn't the highly selective pursuit of only the director, while apparently ignoring these widespread cultural issues acknowledged in the OIG report, doesn't that prove that this is a targeted top-down political action rather than a comprehensive effort to enforce professionalism across the board? It looks an awful lot like singling out the highest-profile political adversary for maximum public effect.
I see the point about selectivity. But acknowledging a badder cultural problem within the FBI, the unauthorized media contacts, the use of personal devices, that does not, and I believe should not, nullify the need to hold the director accountable for his own, arguably egregious breaches. Accountability really has to start at the very top. The OIG specifically noted that Comey's decision set a potentially dangerous precedent for the FBI by encouraging a culture of individual defiance. And moreover, the current criminal charges, they relate specifically to his sworn testimony regarding classified information and authorizing leaks. This stems directly, it seems, from the OIG finding that Comey himself violated policy by retaining and leaking his own memos, specifically to spur a special counsel. So his initial policy breaches provided the fertile ground for these subsequent criminal allegations. We simply cannot excuse an FBI director who believes he is above the rules, regardless of his stated intentions, because that kind of institutional defiance, well, it eventually metastasizes into precisely the kind of legal trouble we are seeing now.
Okay, let's maybe shift to the standard of accountability, because this is a critical legal distinction often missed in all the political noise. Consider the high standard Comey himself set for others. He publicly criticized Hillary Clinton's handling of classified information as extremely careless. Now remember that the mid-year prosecutors, that was the team investigating the Clinton email server, they determined that the relevant statutory term, grossly negligent, required a state of mind just a little short of being willful or criminally reckless. Comey intentionally deviated from that statutory language in his public statement, essentially lowering the public standard for critique while carefully sidestepping the actual legal standard required for prosecution. So, in light of his own subsequent documented breaches, using personal email for FBI business, retaining and leaking memos, why should the public or the legal system grant Comey sort of intellectual charity regarding his own policy compliance now? I actually agree with you that the tension between the standard Comey applied to others and the latitude he took for himself is, well, it's glaring. But my key concern remains. That tension doesn't automatically transform his later contested actions into criminal conduct worthy of this kind of unprecedented prosecution, orchestrated, it seems, by the executive's political allies.
That is a compelling analysis of the standard, yes, and it certainly highlights Comey's apparent hypocrisy, which definitely matters to the public's perception of his credibility. But let me challenge your conclusion there. The question isn't just whether Comey was careless or hypocritical. The question before the court now is whether the current charges, making false statements, unauthorized disclosure potentially, are supported by evidence that meets the criminal threshold. The investigation is alleging that Comey lied under oath, which is a specific, high-level criminal offense. So while the politics are, yes, ugly, if the evidence demonstrates deliberate false statements regarding sensitive information, then arguably the prosecution is justified, regardless of who occupies the White House. If we start dismissing every prosecution involving a political figure as purely a hit job, simply because the president voiced an opinion, well, we effectively grant immunity to all high-level officials whenever the political environment gets polarized. And that, I think, would erode the rule of law far more dangerously than even a potentially politically motivated inquiry.
I have to disagree entirely on that immunity point. The core issue here is the weaponization of the Justice Department, not necessarily the ultimate guilt or innocence of the defendant on these specific charges. Whether Comey was, guilty of being a dirty cop, as the president claims, or merely committed severe policy errors years ago, the ultimate issue here is the legitimacy of this prosecution's origin and execution. The fact that a sitting president, who openly declared him a destroyer of lives, explicitly pressured his appointed attorney general, who happens to be a former personal lawyer, to move now to prosecute, well, that indicates that this indictment serves primarily as a political tool designed to punish a high-profile adversary. When the Justice Department's prosecutorial decisions appear openly dictated by a campaign of presidential retribution, the integrity of the entire process is lost. And that renders the result, however factually accurate the underlying claim might turn out to be, fundamentally compromised in my view.
And that is where we diverge most sharply, I suppose. I see the political orchestration as perhaps unfortunate window dressing, but I still see a body of documented misconduct that provides a necessary legal basis, or at least a plausible one, for these charges. Comey, it seems, believed he was the exception to the rule, and the charges relating to subsequent lying about leaks appear to be a direct result of that initial institutional defiance. So to dismiss this as purely political risks overlooking the substantive need to establish that even the leaders of law enforcement must follow the law and adhere to protocols, particularly regarding classified information and sworn testimony.
All right, so to summarize my position, the indictment, yes, it's factually rooted in a contested allegation about lying under oath concerning leaks, but its true significance, I believe, lies entirely in the political theater surrounding it. You have the clear and documented presidential pressure, the rapid replacement of career prosecutors with political allies, and the immediate, almost celebratory declaration of justice in America. These elements raise profound, almost existential concerns about whether the rule of law is being applied fairly or if it's being deployed as a political weapon to silence perceived enemies.
And from my perspective, while the political context is certainly unavoidable, and absolutely demands scrutiny, the indictment cannot simply be dismissed as just a cynical hit job. Comey's documented self-serving decisions back in 2016 were already criticized by the OIG for prioritizing personal judgment over institutional policy. That created a foundation of misconduct that led, arguably directly, to his subsequent issues with classified materials and testimony. So this case forces us to confront the very severe question of whether a high-ranking official's consistent pattern of non-compliant conduct warrants criminal consequences, regardless of who happens to be in power at the moment.
So we have presented what we believe are the strongest arguments regarding the James Comey indictment, digging into both the legal precedents and the undeniable political context. We encourage you, our perceptive listeners, to review the evidence we've discussed today and formulate your own informed conclusion.
Does the documented evidence, the history, support the conclusion that this is a necessary pursuit of accountability, a required check on an official who perhaps believed he was above the rules?
Or is the overwhelming political context, the pressure, the timing, proof that this is actually a clear case of political retribution? The justice system weaponized against a perceived enemy.
We really want to know what you think. If you believe Comey is ultimately guilty and should face consequences for his alleged crimes, based on the evidence presented in the indictment, write "lock" in the comments below.
And if you believe he is innocent of these specific charges, perhaps because the political manipulation of the justice system taints the entire process, write "free."
Yeah, take a moment right now. You can pause the show and share your feelings, your analysis in the comments.
Absolutely. There is much more to explore in these foundational issues of government transparency and institutional integrity, and we really thank you for engaging with the debate.